It was a sweltering afternoon in a dusty western town where justice was often decided not by laws, but by skin color, wealth, and who stood tallest with a rifle in hand. The courthouse steps were packed that day, boots scraping wood and whispers swelling like thunderclouds about to burst. In the center of it all stood a man who should have been invisible by the standards of his time, a former slave named Elias, quiet, weathered, with hands calloused by chains and harvests not his own. But what happened next would shake that town to its core and silence the hatred that once ruled its streets. Moments earlier, a little white girl had burst from the saloon, tears streaking her cheeks, terror in her eyes. The angry murmurs around her barely softened when Elias stepped into the square. Yet without hesitation, he walked straight toward her, placing himself between the child and the rising crowd, arms wide and firm like a gate against a storm. Gasps erupted, not just because of what he did, but because of who he was. In that instant, every breath seemed to pause, and time bent under the weight of what was unfolding. No one could have imagined that the very man they had once spat on, mocked, and ignored would now stand as the sole shield for a child not his own. Elias didn't speak. He didn't have to. His actions, simple, human, and holy, echoed louder than sermons or speeches ever could. It wasn't just protection. It was defiance, dignity, a cry for decency in a world that had forgotten how to see it in someone like him. Then, as the sheriff moved to intervene, a voice called from the judge's bench, deep, authoritative, and quivering. Judge Whitmore, a man known for iron rulings and a spine stiffened by pride, descended the steps. The crowd parted as if a ghost walked among them. What he did next made even the crows fall silent in the skies above. The judge dropped to his knees, not before the child, not before the sheriff, but before Elias. The crowd froze. In that single motion, generations of silence cracked. This was not just a moment of courage. It was a reckoning. And for those who thought they understood power, justice, or race, that day rewrote the rules. What made a man noble wasn't the color of his skin or the title before his name. It was the willingness to stand when it cost everything, and to kneel when it meant giving something greater. And that was only the beginning. Elias had never asked for recognition. He had worked the land long before it was ever his, tilled soil under the command of cruel masters, and built homes he'd never sleep in. After freedom came, it didn't arrive with a ribbon or reward. It came with the quiet reality of being alone, expected to vanish into the dust. So he bought a patch of dry land, just beyond the ridge, built his own cabin with hands that still trembled from the past, and spoke only when spoken to. The townfolk called him the Quiet One, but never dared look him in the eye. The girl he had shielded that day was named Lottie Mae, daughter of the town's blacksmith, and known for sneaking sugar cubes from the mercantile when her mother wasn't watching. She'd wandered too close to a scuffle outside the saloon, where tempers were hot and liquor had loosened men's mouths into poison. A bottle flew, a man shoved another, and before anyone could stop it, chaos surged forward like a busted dam. Elias had been walking to town with a satchel of flowers slung over his shoulder when he saw her stumble and cry. Without thinking, without caring what would be said or done, he dropped the sack and ran. His shadow was still feared by many in that town, but fear couldn't hold back the instinct carved deep into his soul, to protect the innocent, even if the innocent didn't carry his name, his blood, or his color. The crowd saw him first as a threat, a figure moving too fast. Then they saw Lottie Mae in his arms, clinging to his shirt, and it shifted something in the air. The sheriff yelled to stand down, unsure if Elias was a savior or something more dangerous in their narrow eyes. Guns were gripped, hands twitched near holsters. But Elias stood still, his back to the crowd, his body the only barrier between them and the sobbing child. It wasn't courage driven by applause. It was a reflex born from pain, from knowing what it meant to be unprotected in a world that turned its back on the weak. And then Judge Whitmore emerged from the shadows of the courtroom balcony. He had watched it all unfold from above, his lips tight, eyes narrowed. A man of law hardened by war and reputation. He was no stranger to verdicts. But what he saw in Elias, the selflessness, the silent defiance, the strength to stand where most would run, broke something inside him that no gavel ever could. When he descended those stairs, the whole town held its breath. And as he knelt, the story began to change. The silence that fell over the square was heavy, like a blanket soaked in years of unspoken truths. Elias didn't move. Not when the judge knelt, not when the sheriff finally lowered his hand, not even when Lottie Mae whispered into his chest, "Don't let them take me." His eyes, dark and unreadable, met the judge's. There was no anger in them, no triumph. Only a tired clarity, the kind worn by those who had seen the world strip everything away and still chose to remain kind. Judge Whitmore's voice broke through the hush. "I was wrong," he said, the words scraping out like dry bark. "This man has more honor than half the men I've sentenced or defended." He turned to the crowd, not as a judge, but as a witness, and what he said next would echo for decades. Today, we don't measure a man by his past. We measure him by what he protects. For a town carved from the traditions of silence and separation, it was the first true verdict spoken out loud. There was resistance, of course. Not everyone changed their hearts that day. Some scoffed, some spat, but others wept. And slowly, one by one, people began to understand that Elias wasn't just a man who had shielded a child. He was the kind of man they wished they had been in that moment. Even the blacksmith, Lottie Mae's father, stepped forward, shame in his eyes and gratitude trembling in his hands. He offered a nod. Not much, but in that place and time, it was a monument. Lottie Mae refused to leave Elias' side for hours, her small fingers clinging to his calloused hand. When her mother arrived and swept her into trembling arms, the girl cried. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Trust. She knew something had shifted, even if she didn't have the words for it. Elias didn't stay to watch the rest. He simply nodded at the judge, adjusted the strap on his shoulder, and began walking home, his flour bag still lying in the dirt where he dropped it. But the story didn't end in that square. Word of what happened traveled beyond the county lines, into towns where stories like these weren't supposed to exist. And as the dust settled on that dry afternoon, a new question began to take root in the minds of many. What if more men chose to stand like Elias, and more leaders chose to kneel like Whitmore? The answer would begin to reveal itself in the days to come. The next morning, the sun crept over the horizon with an unfamiliar stillness. Elias rose early, as he always did, before the rooster crowed, before the world could remind him of its injustices. But that day, something had changed. A quiet knock came at his door. Not fists, not shouts, just a respectful tap. When he opened it, he found a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a small jar of jam, and a note that simply read, "Thank you for her." It was unsigned, but the handwriting was delicate. He didn't need to know who had written it. The gesture said more than words ever could. In town, people whispered as they always had, but now their whispers carried wonder, not contempt. The mercantile owner, who once refused to serve Elias unless the shop was empty, now nodded as he passed by. Children pointed but didn't laugh. And the judge, stern, proud Judge Whitmore, took it upon himself to tell the story to every newcomer who stepped into that courtroom. There is no law, he would say, greater than the courage of one man standing for what's right. Lottie Mae returned to Elias's cabin a week later, this time with her father. The blacksmith looked smaller than Elias remembered, no less strong, but somehow humbled. He cleared his throat, removed his hat, and extended a sack of fresh horseshoes. "I ain't good with words," he said, "but my daughter's alive because of you. That makes you kin, far as I'm concerned." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. He stepped aside and let them in, the old wooden door creaking open like a heart after years of being closed. Days turned into weeks, and the ripples of that stormy afternoon spread. Other former slaves came by to speak with Elias, not because he had given speeches or started a cause, but because he had lived one, quietly, defiantly, truthfully. The strength of the West, they said, wasn't in its revolvers or ranches. It was in men like him, men who bent but never broke, who forgave without forgetting, who guarded innocence even when their own had been stolen. And far beyond the ridge, settlers and travelers began to hear of a man who didn't just survive the West, but redefined what it meant to be a man in it. Not with violence, not with wealth, but with honor. With a single choice to protect a child who looked nothing like him, in a town that once wished he'd disappear. It was a tale that reminded people of something rare and sacred, that in the harshest lands, under the hardest skies, kindness is the most revolutionary act of all. Judge Whitmore became a different man after that day. He no longer walked with the same arrogance that once kept others at arm's length. Instead, he sought out voices long ignored, black farmers, widowed mothers, poor migrants, and listened. It wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility. The kind Elias had shown him in silence, simply by doing what no one else had dared. I knelt because I saw a man who stood taller than any badge or bench, Whitmore confessed one evening at a town gathering. And I won't forget it. Others followed. The sheriff, once quick to judge, began checking his instincts before reaching for his weapon. School teachers started telling the children about what Elias did, not as a legend, but as a lesson. And the church, which had once barred Elias from sitting inside its walls, now welcomed him not just as a guest, but as a symbol of grace itself. He sat quietly in the back pew, hat in hand, eyes closed not in prayer, but in peace. Still, Elias never claimed heroism. He returned to his routines, tending his garden, mending fences, fixing wagon wheels for neighbors too poor to pay. But those who came near him always felt something unspoken, like standing beside an oak tree that had weathered 1,000 storms and still stood strong. Children sought him out with questions. Mothers brought pies they insisted weren't charity, and even drifters tipped their hats in silent respect as they passed his land. Lottie Mae grew up visiting Elias every month, bringing stories of school, ribbons she'd earned, books she was reading. She once asked him why he'd helped her. He thought for a moment and answered, "Because someone once didn't help me." That was all he said, but it was all she needed to hear. In her heart, Elias became more than a protector. He became a measure of what goodness looked like when no one was watching. And though the world beyond their town still roared with injustice, something rare had taken root in that dusty little place. Truth had been spoken not with words, but with actions. A man once enslaved had freed an entire community from the chains of its own ignorance. And as time marched forward, it carried with it the quiet legacy of Elias, the man who stood firm, the man who made a judge kneel, and the man who reminded the West what dignity truly meant. Years passed, and the world around them shifted like the desert winds. The town grew, not much, but enough for new families to arrive, for children to outgrow their boots, and for stories to become tradition. But one tale remained evergreen in its retelling: the day a black man shielded a white child, and a judge laid down his pride. It became the backbone of a new kind of folklore, one that wasn't rooted in gunfights or gold, but in moral courage and unshakable humanity. Elias aged as the seasons demanded. His beard turned silver, his steps slower, but his eyes never lost that fire, the one that saw right through a man's words and straight into his soul. Every year, on the anniversary of that storm, people gathered outside the saloon, not to drink, but to remember. No one planned it formally. It just happened. A circle of silence. A few candles. Lottie Mae always said a few words. Her voice trembled with age, but her memories stayed young. By then, she had children of her own, bright-eyed, wild-hearted kids who knew Elias not as a myth, but as Uncle Eli, the man who taught them how to tie knots, ride bareback, and treat everyone with the same respect they hoped to receive. They listened with wide eyes when she told the story, not of a fight, but of a choice. Not a power, but a principle. It wasn't about skin, it was about soul, and they carried that lesson into every corner of their lives. One winter, when Elias didn't show up at church, the town grew quiet. A small group rode out to his cabin. They found him in his chair by the fire, hands resting on his knees, a calmness in his final breath that felt almost holy. There was no fear in that room, only reverence. The judge, now older and slower himself, stood beside the body and wept openly. "This man saved my soul," he said, "and he never once asked for thanks." Elias was buried beneath a tall cottonwood tree on his land, the kind that holds strong through drought and thunder alike. No fancy tombstone, just a carved piece of wood that read, "He stood when others would not." People came from counties away, from cities and forgotten ranches, all drawn by a story that had become bigger than a man, and yet still somehow, only his. Even after Elias was gone, his influence remained like wind over the plains, unseen, but always felt. The schoolhouse was renamed in his honor, and children grew up learning not just arithmetic and scripture, but decency, humility, and justice, all through his example. Teachers spoke his name not with pity or awe, but with affection. What would Elias do? Became the question whispered among friends when choices got hard. Judge Whitmore retired not long after the funeral. In his final speech, he told the town that he had once believed in law more than life, that justice could only be carved in codes. But Elias showed him that the deepest justice often walks quietly, makes no claims, and asks for nothing in return. It lives, he said, in the space between impulse and action, where character is born. His voice cracked as he stepped down, placing his judge's gavel on Elias's empty chair. Lottie Mae's children carried the torch without knowing it. Her eldest son became a doctor in a neighboring county, her daughter a teacher who kept a drawing of Elias on her desk, beside a worn Bible. They never boasted about their connection. They didn't need to. Their lives were proof of it. Humble, strong, and grounded in something deeper than blood. Grounded in the memory of a man who saw a crying child and made a decision that would echo through generations. As decades rolled on, stories changed, names faded, but Elias's never did. His tale wasn't written in books or shouted from pulpits. It lived in looks exchanged across race and class, in hands extended where once fists were clenched, in choices made during quiet storms of conscience. He didn't need fame. He had something better, respect, earned in the harshest way a man can earn it, by doing what is right when it is hardest. And so the West remembered him, not as a cowboy, not as a preacher, not as a lawman, but as something rarer, a mirror, one that showed everyone who looked into it what they were, what they feared, and, if they had the courage, what they could become. And in that reflection, lit by the glow of a fire long burned out, Elias still stood, tall, unmoving, watching, guiding, forever. In the years that followed, pilgrims of a different kind began arriving at the town, young men chasing a whisper, old women holding letters from their mothers, curious souls longing to stand where Elias once stood. They didn't come for gold, or fame, or even salvation. They came for truth, for the echo of something rare, a man whose story hadn't been polished by legend, but whose life had sharpened the very soul of a town once rusted by prejudice. Some came angry, wrestling with their own demons. They'd stand at Elias's grave, fists clenched, eyes red, asking the wind questions they couldn't ask their fathers. Others came broken, with pasts too heavy to carry alone. And something strange always happened there, beneath that cottonwood tree, as if the silence itself could speak, as if Elias's strength hadn't died, only shifted into the land, into the people, into the choices made when no one's watching. The townsfolk welcomed them, not with banners or ceremonies, but with the same quiet dignity Elias had shown. A bed in the inn, a hot meal, a listening ear. No one ever said, "You're forgiven," or "You're changed." They let the land do that. They let Elias's story breathe through fence posts and dusty trails, through the gentle way they handed over bread or patched a traveler's coat without asking for coin. And it wasn't just individuals who were moved. Entire communities began writing to the town council. Schools requested visits. Churches asked to plant trees in his name. One teacher in the East wrote, "We don't teach Elias's story because it's rare. We teach it because it's what we want our children to become." And the council agreed, not out of pride, but because they too had once stood in judgment and had been changed by a single man's unwavering heart. Through all this, Lottie Mae remained the quiet keeper of the story. Her voice aged, but never lost its clarity. Every spring, she returned to that tree with her grandchildren and whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Eli." The little ones didn't always understand, but they saw the tears in her eyes. They felt the hush in the wind. And slowly, year by year, they came to realize they hadn't just inherited his name. They'd inherited the duty to carry it forward. A nearby town once debated renaming their central street. Some pushed for a general's name, others for a preacher. But a young girl stood up in the meeting, no older than 12, and said, Why not name it after the man who made a judge kneel? Her voice shook the room like thunder. Within a month, the street bore a new sign, Elias Way. And folks walked it differently. Backs a little straighter, heads a little higher, hearts a little fuller. It wasn't long before a book was written. Not by a scholar, but by a ranch hand who'd grown up hearing the tale around campfires. It didn't have perfect grammar or polished prose, but it carried a weight more powerful than ink. It spoke of long days, hard rides, bitter winters, and one act of defiance so pure it thawed the coldest parts of a town's soul. That book was passed hand to hand, never mass-published, but never forgotten. Visitors to the old saloon never imagined its back room once held the beginning of a miracle. But the owners had left the chains on the wall, not as trophies, but as warnings. Above them hung a single line etched into the wood. A man's worth ain't measured by who he saves, but by who he refuses to abandon. It stopped people in their tracks, made them put down their drinks, made them remember. One evening, an elderly white man, struggling to walk, knelt before Elias's grave. He didn't say much, just sat with his hands folded. Later, he told the innkeeper, "I was raised to hate him, but when I saw him lift that girl, I saw God for the first time." No one judged him. No one praised him either, because in that town, redemption was personal, not performative, and forgiveness was sacred, not for show. And as dusk fell over the west once more, casting shadows across wooden porches and forgotten trails, one truth remained clear. Elias never rode with a posse. He never fired the first shot, but he changed more lives than 1,000 bullets ever could. In a land that glorified strength, he proved the mightiest thing a man can do is love without conditions and stand for what's right, even when it costs him everything. By the time the railroad reached the town, stories of Elias had already traveled farther than steel tracks ever could. Conductors would tip their hats as they passed the crossing near the cottonwood tree, and some passengers, hearing the tale for the first time, would press their faces to the window, silent and wide-eyed. It wasn't marked on any map, but everyone knew that bend in the tracks wasn't just geography. It was legacy. A playwright from New Orleans visited once, inspired by the hushed reverence surrounding the town. She stayed 3 weeks, mostly quiet, scribbling notes in her leather book. When she returned home, she wrote a play called The Man Who Made Silence Speak. It played in 10 cities. People wept, not because the story was sad, but because it reminded them of who they wished to be deep down when no one else was watching. Meanwhile, Lottie May grew older. Her hair turned white like winter fields, and her voice became a gentle rasp, but her spirit never dimmed. She often sat on the bench beneath Elias's tree with a shawl around her shoulders and a faraway look in her eyes. Children would ask her, "Why did he do it?" And she would smile faintly and say, "Because he knew no one else would, and because he believed we were all worth it." The bench she sat on became known as the seat of courage. Tourists and townsfolk alike would sit there and feel the breeze, sometimes swearing they could hear boots in the distance or chains quietly falling to the dirt. A sculptor once carved Elias's likeness into a piece of driftwood and placed it beside the bench. No plaque, no signature, just a look in the wooden eyes that seemed to ask, "What would you do if it were you?" Years passed, and generations shifted, but the town never let the story fade. It was sewn into quilts, etched into barn doors, baked into the hush of Sunday bread. And every time a storm gathered on the horizon, literal or otherwise, the townspeople remembered that day when a former slave stepped between a child and a crowd and showed the world what real power looks like. Eventually, a great-grandson of Judge Whitmore returned to the town. He had heard whispers of the story growing up, but dismissed them as legend. Yet when he stood before Elias's grave and read the simple words, he stood when all others looked away. Something inside him cracked open. He wept like a child. He asked to meet Lottie May. She took his hand, looked into his eyes, and whispered, "Your grandfather saw the truth. You can too." In the final years of her life, Lottie May left behind a small book of reflections. Not a memoir, not a history, just glimpses, moments frozen in time. One entry read, "I still remember his hands, not because they were strong, but because they trembled when he held me." Even heroes are scared. They just love louder than their fear. That page was framed and placed beside the town hall's entrance. The legacy of Elias was never about hero worship. It was about possibility. It asked hard questions and demanded quiet answers. It lived not in bronze statues or polished speeches, but in the small moments, when someone chose mercy over anger, truth over silence, and dignity over dominance. It became a mirror held up to a nation still learning what it means to kneel, to protect, to rise. There were towns that tried to forget their pasts, burying names, tearing down buildings, rewriting lines. But this town chose to remember. And not just remember, but relive. Every time a stranger asked for help and was given more than they needed. Every time someone stood up when it would have been easier to stay seated. Every time love spoke louder than hate. And so, beneath the endless sky of the American West, where dust still dances across forgotten trails and wind still hums through weathered fences, the story of Elias lives on, not as a tale from the past, but as a guide for the future. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, a single act of courage can rewrite the whole book. In the dust-covered towns of the Old West, where men were measured by the speed of their draw or the weight of their word, Elias redefined what it meant to be brave. He didn't draw a pistol or speak loud in saloons. He simply stepped forward when a child cried, shielded her when no one else dared, and bowed his back beneath a sky heavy with judgment. His courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, unshakable, and utterly transformative. It reminded a town, and eventually a nation, that true heroism often looks like humility, compassion, and grace in the face of cruelty. The silent reverence that followed Elias's act wasn't about spectacle. It was about awakening. The judge didn't kneel for show. He knelt because he saw something that changed him forever, a man who had every reason to hate, and yet chose to protect. That image, etched into the memory of every soul present, became a moral compass for generations. It whispered that dignity is not reserved for the powerful, but is found in the way we treat the powerless. And Lottie Mae, forever changed by that day, carried forward the legacy not in grand speeches, but in the way she spoke to others, in the way she listened, and in how she passed the truth of that moment to each child who asked. Her life became living proof that a single act of goodness, born in a moment of darkness, can echo across decades. The courage of one became the conscience of many. As you step away from this story, remember, the world may not always offer the same storms, the same gallows, or the same chains, but it will always present us with a choice. To stand up when it's uncomfortable, to speak when silence is easier, to protect when no one else will. These are the acts that shape legacies. These are the moments that turn ordinary people into legends. If this story stirred your spirit, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more tales that reveal the heart of the Old West and the soul of humanity. Like the video if you believe that real strength is found in standing up for the vulnerable. And share in the comments. What would you have done, standing in Elias's boots? Because sometimes a single step forward is all it takes to change the course of history.